Welcome to Beyond Rockets. Hope you're having a great day. My name is Clark Dunn and I'm your host. Get ready to enjoy some awesome conversations from Huntsville locals about cool work they are doing right here in the Rocket City. You can connect with us on social media at Beyond Rockets, and if you're interested in doing a podcast yourself, I'd love to hear from you. You can visit my website, beyondrockets.com today, or connect with me on LinkedIn at Clark Dunn. Sit back and enjoy this episode of Beyond Rockets.
Everything I liked except the way she talked to me every day.
This episode is sponsored by Yellowhammer Brewing. Yellowhammer is a local craft brewery serving Huntsville for the past 14 years. They are known for their premium craft beers like their T-Minus and Rebellion, but what you might not know is they also offer spirits, wine, seltzers, and non-alcoholic drinks. Next time you stop by their location, try one of their seasonal cocktails made with the Gemini Bourbon or the Yellowhammer Vodka, or try this year's big hit Pineapple Punch Seltzer. You can find out more information about Yellowhammer Brewery by visiting their website, yellowhammerbrewery.com, or visiting their tap room located at Campus 805. Well, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. This is a great setup. I know we were just talking about that, but I love this setup. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. So would you like to introduce yourself and we'll kind of get started there?
Oh, yeah. So I'm SueAnne Griffith and I run the Lily Flagg Signal podcast doing local history stories. And there's a social media aspect as well. I do videos and some photos of just historic Huntsville things and interviews with people that work around town in history spaces. But it started out as just a podcast and I've just kind of grown from there. Yeah.
And so you're originally from the Huntsville area, originally girly. Talk a little bit about growing up here. I mean, at the time, we're close in age. A lot of people didn't want to stay here. A lot of friends thought it was not cool. Talk about your experiences growing up here and kind of did you envision that once you got through college or whatever, that you would then be still in Huntsville?
So I have literally ping-ponged back and forth on it with staying. But I grew up in Gurley, which was population, I want to say it was 802 or 803, the census they did when I was in high school.
Wow.
So I was like, all right, well, I remember growing up, you have to drive, 20, 30 minutes to the nearest store. And then we didn't really have air conditioning in the backseat of the car. So you had to put the ice cream up front. That's how rural it was. I couldn't see another house out of my window.
Wow.
In the woods. So it was I was from Huntsville. On the weekends we'd come in big spring jam. Like I said, same AD, we remember that kind of thing. But it was still it felt like a small town. And I think it's almost, I don't say doubled in population since I was born, but Huntsville's grown just so much that I realized when you say oh, it's a whole different city now. I've seen, you and I both seen that happen. That's real.
It's incredible. I mean, even in the last 5 or 6 years, it has just since graduating high school and then kind of okay, I'm staying here. I'm going to school here. Okay. There's a little bit more cooler things that are coming. And then now it's every time I walk downtown, or drive somewhere off University, it's wait, when did that get there? Or when did that get there?
I drove through Gurley yesterday for a thing for work. And I was like, who put these buildings here? And it's I know they didn't show up overnight, but I just had this moment who put this here? And that's, so I did college undergrad down in Auburn. Okay. And did 2 engineering bachelor's degrees down there. Came back up here. I wanted to be an astronaut at that point. So I came back up here because what do you do when you want to be an astronaut?
You come to Huntsville. That's the place to be.
That's what you do. So did grad school at UAH. And worked full time there because life hack, if you work for the university, you get classes for free. So that's how I went to grad school for free, did the master's, did the PhD all in engineering, defended a week before COVID hit. So I was one of the last live dissertation defenses, which meant we could have food. Because then after that, the idea of a shared food buffet thing is wild.
I can't believe we ever did that.
And we didn't even realize how special that was because it was oh yeah, this is normal. And then a week later, everything closed.
Yeah, it's this is not normal anymore. We now have a whole new normal.
Right. And that was during COVID. So I moved back to Auburn. I was a engineering professor down there. And I realized I led with, I'd have a history podcast and I've yet to mention any history things, but did that down there. Missed my family up here, missed everything up here. So moved back. Like I said, I literally ping ponged twice away and then back now. Wow. So it's funny. I'll tell people that when I moved to Huntsville last time, or when I moved to Huntsville 2 times ago, it's I keep coming back and I was I need to just stay.
So obviously you have that background in engineering, engineering is you've done a ton of school for it. You're an expert in that field. Was the passion for history and Huntsville history in particular something you've always had, or is that something you had on one of your visits back?
It's been always there. I realize it's cheesy to say as long as I can remember, but I remember it would have been either kindergarten or maybe early first grade doing a walking tour of downtown. So just about as long as I can remember, we did one of the moms in our class worked downtown and did a little history walking tour and told us some of the stories that I've then gotten to more heavily research and do on the podcast, and told us some of those. And like, oh, this is the big spring. That was the water source. You know, this bank has been here since the 1830s. You know, this house. And they did tell us about Lily Flagg even, which is kind of came full circle. But I always had those in the back of my head. And I was like, oh, I want to be a character in the Maple Hill Cemetery stroll someday. And now I am, and I'm on the board for that. Like, it's one of those, I got there eventually. And same with the reenacting. Like, I sew all my own clothes. So I was like, oh, I could make the costumes for that. I could do that. And then now I'm doing that. But so it's been there for, that was about 6 when I started. So it was always in the back of my head. And I did as much as I could, like I would read books and whatnot, but it didn't really occur to me I could actually be active in it because I didn't have a degree in history until I started the show September 2022. And that was a few months in the making, like before I actually put out an episode. But that was kind of when I realized, like, oh, I can just research this and share this with people, because I was already researching it and it was just kind of all in my head. I was like, oh, I can put this out there. Like, maybe somebody will care. Like, maybe some poor kid's going to have a school project and it'll help to have this out there. And I didn't think the general public would in any way be interested. Wow. I just was like, I should put this out here, just not be greedy with it. And I made a joke to my friend Katie Ganaway, WLRH, and I was like, oh, you do audio stuff. I'm thinking of doing a podcast just because I can just ramble about this thing if I want to. And said totally as a joke. And then a few months later, I started doing it. So it was always in the back of my head, but I never felt qualified. I'm like 3 or 4 classes away from a history degree, but I still was just like, oh, I'm not, I don't have decades of experience in this. Who am I to be in here doing all of this history stuff? But it's working out.
So like, there's one thing to be like, it seemed like that progression of saying, hey, I want to do this podcast was a pretty quick thing. It was one of those like, hey, I'm doing this already. You told one person. That one person was kind of interested, or kind of like
showed so encouraging,
showed some support. And you're like, well, if that person likes it, then I'm going to do it. Was that kind of the tipping point?
I think so. Cause it was like, I feel like a lot of us, we have those ideas and you'll say it maybe offhand to a friend or two. And secretly you're kind of judging the reaction. Like, all right, is everyone going to say I'm the cringiest person ever? Because if my friends hate it, strangers are definitely like, I had that kind of thing. And all my friends were like, oh yeah, no, I bet you'd be good at that. That'd be cool. Because I admittedly, like I said, I was a professor. So like sharing info by talking was kind of my day job anyway. So it was like, oh, it's just different topics. Like, yeah, you could do that. Had the saddest audio equipment set up ever, but I could at least get the stories out. Shout out to my 2016 MacBook that is somehow still kicking.
There you go. And I think for you doing these projects and like doing these episodes, there's a lot of research that goes involved. Yes. Talk a little bit about that process of you thinking, hey, this is an episode that I want to do, versus the timeline of it actually getting recorded and released. Like, what is happening during that? So
some of the time from start to finish, I have some that I had the drafts written up before I ever put the first episode out, and those still have not seen the light of day. Partly because information's hard to find, or sometimes I get writer's block with it, and I'm saying like, okay, how do I make this sound interesting? Or, like, this person's life is fascinating to me, but will anyone even care? Or some of them, it's like this, like talking about Werner von Braun and his background. He worked for Nazi Germany and then came here and helped Huntsville grow. And that whole thing is just, there's so much nuance and so many people I want to talk to and get their perspective. That's like, it's taking me over 2 years just to get everybody's thoughts and get a good enough groundwork to be like, all right, I feel comfortable discussing this just with the general public and feel like I have enough background. But the standard episodes, so like most of them that are just me doing a topic. A lot of them, like I said, even when I was 6, like doing that history tour, there were things that I was like, oh, I remember that. That was a cool story. So like those ones, I'll have the idea in my head. I'm like, I want to talk about, for example, the backwards house, which is a house that, as the name implied, they literally built it backwards, and the owners that commissioned it were out of town. So they get back and they're like, what did you do? What did you do to my baby? And just over the years, they've tried to make it look not backwards, and they've had some interesting people that lived in it. So with ones like that, first of all, just confirming the story is true. Because the problem with growing up around here is that you hear like 9 different versions of the same story from 10 different people. Yeah. So figuring out how much of that is true, how much of that is at least plausible that I can say, all right, well, this seems like it may have been a thing. So I'm comfortable mentioning, oh, I've heard this from multiple people, but none of them firsthand, gauging the realities of it. Black Widow of Hazel Green was another one like that, where it's like, oh, we've got this serial killer. It's like, the average life expectancy back then was like 40. So was she killing them, or is that just,
or they just like dying?
Yeah. And so like that kind of thing, you're like, all right, how much of this is hyped up? Because everybody loves a good story. So when you're hyping it up, a lot of it is just piecing through that. Paperwork wise, the public library, the archives downtown, they've got so many primary sources, books. They've got, like it's one of this point. I mean, I hang out with the archivists there. Just like we actually last night went to bar trivia together. So it's like they know me now. I'm unescapable. But I'll send them an email and be like, hey, I saw you've got a file on this and this. Can I come check that out? And I usually take a photo on my phone so that I can, zoom in and read through it later. Go through all of those, the deeds and property records, court records. A lot of it is just staring at pieces of paper and or staring at a screen, which content production wise is hard because I'm like, look at this cool thing I found. It's in really hard to read blurry cursive, but I promise it's interesting.
And I promise it's there.
And I promise it's there. Yeah, it's like, I promise this is real. Old photos are my favorite because people actually like seeing like, oh, that's what that used to look like. But a lot of it is the old like city directories, which is like phone books, but somehow more informative. Like it has their job titles and everything.
Wow.
And I'm like, we thought Facebook was telling a lot about us. Like this was just a book you could just go buy that had everybody's name, address, and workplace in it.
Wow.
But that's really helpful for me now, like 130 years later. I'm like, oh yeah, no, what was this person doing, in 1898? Oh, they were working. Okay, good. That confirms this thing. So there's a lot of like cross-checking, and my notes are absurd sometimes. I'll have to have little arrows drawn between things, but I'd say maybe for a 20-minute episode, research-wise, probably put maybe like 20 hours in.
Wow.
And that's probably
and
part of it.
It can be the course over a month you're doing it, or it can be the course over years.
Oh, yeah.
It's not just like, hey, I did 20 hours and I had an episode. It's 20 hours cumulative.
Right. Yeah. Spread out. And then I'll sometimes find things by accident too.
Really?
Like I'm looking into this person and I'll read like a newspaper article. Or it's like, wait, they were at a party with so-and-so, but that's that guy from that other thing. Huh. Okay. So he was and then I'll just add a sentence or two into that script. And I'll usually have like 5 or 6 things going at once.
Wow.
Which is, the notes are terrible. If I go back to them too much later and I go look at it, I'm like, what was I trying to say here?
And so like, I know personally, like whenever I'm downtown, walking through downtown or walking through like the historic neighborhoods, I always see the houses and I'll tell my wife like, hey, that house was actually only been owned by 3 people. Like it was built in the 1890s, but then it only had 3 owners since. And like all these things that like, I am interested in real estate and buildings and kind of what that looks like. So when I think about when I go downtown, it's like my brain is always like, oh, the Russel Erskine and what it was in what it was. And then, you like the Terry Hutchins building and like its history in town being like one of the first skyscrapers in Huntsville. And so you have these things. Is that kind of how your brain works too? As you're going downtown, do you see things or notice things maybe that have been here for a long time that maybe you didn't notice before that you're like, maybe I should do an episode of that, or I should research that a little bit more?
All the time. And even if it's a newer building, I'll sometimes say like, what was that for? And that's led to some fun ones as well. But yeah, I'll say if I go on a walk with people, especially if I have friends come in from out of town, it's almost like, cool. So you didn't sign up for this, but between where we parked and where we're going to eat, you're going to hear an entire history tour. Congrats. So I'll do that a lot because I like telling people about it. But if I'm by myself, I'll sometimes see, like, oh, I've seen that name in the cornerstone of that building. I don't know who that is. I need to fix that. Yeah. And I'll just like make a note and then go home and or go to the library and just find as much as I can on it. So it's very much, I'm glad other people do it too.
Yeah. And like, because I think for me, it's one of those, like, I like to know, the story. Like I like, like cityscapes and just like that whole development of creating a city and just the different stages it goes through. And so to think through like, the neighborhoods and like where the courthouse is and, the Spite House on Lincoln and like why it was built and like, all the history that's involved with that is interesting to me. And then like you can then track it down to like, generations of people now that are here that are 3 or 4 generations past that person but they're still in Huntsville and they're still contributing and they're still part of the community, which I think is a pretty cool thing. How often do you research something and you start getting into it? Maybe you're 15, 20 hours in, and then you realize maybe this isn't an episode. Does that happen often? Or does most of the time when you get that far in, you're like, hey, this is going to be an episode no matter what?
Usually if I get that far in, I have a hard time like killing off my darlings. So I'll normally divide it up at least and say, okay, well, maybe this isn't a topic, but I'll sometimes do like viewer listener request episodes. And sometimes those will fit in there. Like I did a lot on the different buildings. Actually, I'm glad you're wearing the green bus shirt because that's that building is one of the Coffin building is one of my favorites. That somebody asked, like, what was this building?
Yeah.
And I started doing this whole in-depth thing. And I was like, it'd be great for a 5-minute episode, but there's not really that much else to say. So I could put it in the listener request one because someone did ask about it. So I'll normally incorporate them into other things. I do have a few, like there was this guy, it's not enough for a real episode, but he was from Virginia and his summer, or I guess winter home was down here. And he was known as the Salt King. And he made like a bunch of money selling salt. And his name was White. And that's what White Street was named for. And I was like, well, I mean, like
that's kind of the end of the story.
Yep. That's it right there. So I've been like digging, trying to find like, please tell me he had something cool so I can at least get like a 10-minute mini episode out of this. But it's like, that's been sitting there.
And I feel like for moments like that, where like it's a short story like that, I mean, like those listener requests or like doing like a combined episode where there's multiple, like, hey, we're covering, downtown Huntsville, and it's these like short stories almost of different locations. Cause like I would say a lot of them, like Russel Erskine was one of your first episodes. And so talk a little bit about that process of maybe doing your first one. Never done it before. You're kind of researching it and you've never done a podcast. You do this first podcast. How's that process? Is it the same as what you do now, or have you kind of fine-tuned that process a little bit better?
I think in some ways I fine-tuned it, and in some ways because I'm less anxious now, because I'm like, oh, people do care. And like there's in that way, I've gotten me to be a little bit more loose with it, in that I can have more fun. At first I was like, okay, this is gonna be like a faceless account. No one's gonna know who's doing this. It's gonna be very strictly like, here is my research. And then we move on. But with interacting with people are like, no, we want to hear like, oh, you're from here. What's your perspective on this? And it's like, oh, I can include my opinion. So in that way, it's gotten a little looser, but I've still got very much my process of, I have my script and I color code, find research on this. I have different like color codes on, I still need a source on this or fill this in. And all of that's kind of been the same. It's the same technique I used for writing my like actual dissertation. I just copied that over. Okay. So I still have my like academic approach with the writing side. But that first episode, I guess because I didn't know where to start, I just was like, okay, we'll do what you know, academics. And went through, that one was one of those stories that I had heard. And I was like, I don't know why anyone would make this up. This is so specific. Because it was about the Russel Erskine and how in 1938, there were these airplanes that were flying down from up north trying to get to Florida. There's a storm. They see the Russel Erskine that used to have a 2-story light on top that just said Hotel Russel Erskine. And they saw that and they're like, oh, this must be a big city. We can probably land here because we're running out of fuel. There's a storm, but bright lights must mean big city. And then they tried to find the airport and couldn't, because their airport at that point was just a sad little field in South Huntsville. And these 2 police officers saw the circling airplanes, and there were like a dozen or so of them. And they were like, oh, I bet they're trying to land, because we know there's a storm coming. And so they got on the radio station and told everyone, if your car has headlights, which if your car has headlights is in itself a fascinating thing, go out and line the runway and turn your lights on so they can find the runway. Wow. I was like, oh, that's such a cute like town coming together story. Everyone's like, oh, this is a tearjerker. Like everyone's helping everybody. And they all landed safely. They had a party at the Russel Erskine afterwards. And I was like, this sounds great. Is it true though? Yeah. And that, and it is entirely true. That is exactly what happened.
That's crazy.
And that, so, which was encouraging too. I feel like if the first one I'd researched had been false, this podcast would not have happened. Like, it's a good thing that first story was true and was as good as it sounded. Because I was like, how much of this is embellished? Like, were there really a bunch of cars on the runway? And I found like memoirs from people who were there talking about like, oh, as a kid, I remember hearing this on the radio, and my family went out and we got to meet the pilots. I was like, oh, this definitely real.
I mean, I think the Russel Erskine's one of those like, I mean, it's iconic for Huntsville in my opinion. I think, when you're coming into downtown on Clinton, it's one of the things you see. You can see it for miles. You can see it even on the other side of 565. And I think of like that history of the Russel Erskine. I went to an event there back in, I don't know, maybe 2020, 2019. It was right before COVID. So it was in 2019, right after I started the podcast. And it's the first time I'd ever been in that building. They used to do a Twickenham sort of like Trill Fest kind of thing where they would have like
music and
So like I was invited to that event in like the atrium of the Russel Erskine, and it was just like my wife and I were just like, this is beautiful. Like, I have never been in this space. This is incredible. Like, it's one of those places that I would say for most Huntsvillians now don't get to experience that space, even if they've lived here forever. Because it's just kind of just like what it is today is not kind of the same thing as it was then. Then you have things like the Montesano Hotel and all of that history along with that, and like it burning down and kind of all the like I think Huntsville is such a unique thing because we look at that history from hundreds of years ago potentially, but then there's also stuff that we're doing now that we don't realize is going to be history. That then even in 20, 30, 40 years, we're going to be talking about this to our kids or whoever it might be, that like, hey, like that's what it was like when I grew up. And it's like, whoa, like how old are you kind of thing. But it's like, it's incredible to see. And I think Huntsville's one of those cities that has really progressed so quickly. Like I feel like for a long time, it kind of was under its same, like people knew it for the like farming and stuff like that. And then it became a space program city, and then now it's become the biggest city in the state. Right. And so you have all these iterations, which is incredible to see. I know that you do episodes every Monday during the season. Talk a little bit about the season structure and kind of what that looks like on your end, and then how often are you doing seasons?
So that varies a lot. I was doing a really good job of the weekly thing. This past December started a new job, and so I've been in kind of a just figure out my new life schedule mode. I've gotten, next week I'm doing an interview with a group of people. And then I've got another 2 scheduled and one that's about to come out. So I have they said we're about to start back for real now after I've had 3 or 4 months to kind of get my life together. But because it is just my hobby and not my day job. This is not the thing that pays for my, I have 7 cats and the thing that pays for their food gets prioritized.
Yes.
So this is very much like a hobby project for the most part. And though I do have people who have sponsored it and like patrons and whatnot, and I really appreciate, all of that. But I said, I got to prioritize the job that has the insurance and whatnot. So I've had a bit of a break, but normally I'll do, once I've gotten a few ready to go, or at least the scripts written, even if I haven't fully recorded all of them, then I'll be like, all right, next week we're going to start getting them out, week at a time. This past fall, I tried to focus on a few longer stories where it's like, this is not reasonable for me to do these a week at a time, because they were, instead of my normal like 20 to 25, these were like 45, 50 minute longer ones. And so those ones I was like, all right, we're just going to do once a month because I cannot talk this much and have time to do things like eat and whatnot outside of my daily routine. So because the editing takes, where the editing takes so much longer than the actual recording most of the time. So that kind of played into it as well, because an hour-long episode for me, because I'm a team of just me, so it takes a while to edit through that. On top of all the writing, like I said, the 20 hours was just getting the research in, and then got to write the script and edit it and everything. So with those ones, it was a little bit more spread out. But I'm hopefully getting back into more of the 20 minutes. Just here is a thing you can listen to on your drive into work or back home, and then here's some fun facts you can share, and not have it be this huge production like college class lecture size thing. Because I said, coming from being a professor, like I have to remind myself like totally different format than what I used to do in that regard. And also remembering something I'm trying to bring in more is, as you mentioned, this is a city of transplants for the most part, and really always has been, and how it's growing. So there are people that we grew up hearing about these things or knowing about the Russel Erskine, even if we hadn't been inside. I've had people say, "Oh, I always wondered why it said hotel on the side and wasn't a hotel." And it was like, "Oh, yeah, no, you would." Yeah, and it's like, "Oh, yeah, you have no reason to know that. Yeah, you've lived here 5 months. Like that's not been a priority, understandably." So remembering to incorporate that sort of thing into the show.
Yeah, because I feel like there's some things that we just take as like obviously that is the thing, but then you're like, wait a second, the average person that's listening to this is probably someone that's been here less than 5 years. And so they just see it as hotel, but it's not, or they just see, this building as, that's where Coffee Clutch is. But like, actually that building became this and was like one of the first, like all these little things. It's like, oh, wait a second. I need to actually like get it. I need to think about the average person listening, not what I know. Cause like, know it all. So it's like, you're trying to explain it that way, but then you almost have to kind of take it back and go explain it a little bit easier for anybody that could listen to it. Is you've done a lot of different stories, a lot of research on different things, episodes that have come out, episodes that haven't come out, episodes that maybe won't come out. Is there one story that sticks out, or one thing that you love the most history wise that you've done, or that you've researched, or that you have thought about doing an episode on?
I want to do a kind of cumulative one of people who are new to town can just sit and that's going to be one either longer or a multi-part where it just kind of covers, in the 1830s, here's what went down. In the 1840s, here's what went down, and just have maybe 5 to 10 minutes on each decade, just so you have, at least kind of that background to be like, oh, that's why it's like that. Of the ones I've put out, I think my favorites are when I've learned about people that I didn't know so much about before. I have one coming out on Dr. Councill, who founded what's now Alabama A&M. And that one, I knew who he was, but I didn't know how kind of full circle his story came. He was born into enslavement and was actually, he and his family were sold at what was then the Green Bottom Inn, which was a racetrack that Andrew Jackson went to. And it was up in North Huntsville. And then, after the war, he focuses on education, and he eventually, his school gets big enough that he gets money to move, and the land that they put his school on is where the Green Bottom Inn was. So the place where he and his family were sold as enslaved people became where he set up his own university.
Wow.
And the president's mansion was part of that old hotel. So the kind of reclaiming, full circle thing there, that was one of those things I was like, why do we not talk about this? This needs to be a movie. Dr. Councill needs a movie in general, but I was like, this is so ready to be a blockbuster movie.
Oh yeah.
That one. And, the other, so we talked about the Russel Erskine and then the Coffee Clutch building, the Terry Hutchins building, the third old skyscraper, the Times building. I loved learning about that because the man that founded the Huntsville Times was absolutely bonkers. Literally tried to throw hands with a senator.
Okay.
Would walk slowly in front of the trolley because fun fact, we had trolleys for about 30 years, would walk slowly in front of it just to draw attention to himself. So many,
Wow.
he built a castle at 5 Points where Tenders is now, that whole little triangle. He bought a house, built a brick or stone castle around an extant house, and made it look like a 3-tier wedding cake thing.
Interesting.
And just learning all that, I was I walk by that all the time.
Yeah.
Because I love walking around looking at the old houses, and it's no idea. Because now it's 2 gas stations and a chicken restaurant.
Yeah.
That used to be literally a castle. Well,
That's amazing.
Huntsville Castle. So that was one of my other favorite ones of just what was wrong with this guy? He was arrested for fraud a few times. Crazy guy.
Wow. And so, obviously you're kind of getting back into the swing of things with the podcast as you've started this new job. If someone's listening to this podcast and they want to find out more about your podcast, listen to it themselves, where's the best place for them to connect with you on social media? Where's the best place for them to listen? Where can they listen?
So I've got it right now. The podcast itself is on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and possibly some other, just if it's not on your streaming service, honestly, I'll try to get it added. If you do look and don't find it, it's just under Lily Flagg's signal. Because the famous cow, and I have cow earrings on. I tried to rep the cow thing, but the cow's name was Signals Lily Flagg. So that's where that's coming from. And then social media, it's gonna be Lily Flagg Podcast.
Awesome.
Flagg has 2 G's in it because the original, the cow, they spelled it that way for the cow. So I kept the 2 G's.
There you go. And the logo with the cow. I love how every episode you kind of dress up the cow.
Yes.
And you kind of make it fit that episode, which I think is super cool. But we'll be sure to have everything in the episode notes. So if anyone wants to listen, find links to the links to your social media, links to listen on Apple or Spotify, we'll be sure to have that below. But I appreciate you being here today. It was a lot of fun to kind of learn a little bit more about your story. I think, you've carved your niche into the community, into podcasting that's very unique. And so it's exciting to kind of see, and it's exciting to kind of see all the future stories that you'll be able to showcase. Cause I think there's so much that you're probably researching that you're excited to get out, and so much more that you haven't even found out about yet.
Oh yeah. So I had somebody ask me, do I ever think I'll run out of content? And I just kind of looked around. I was like, absolutely not.
Yeah, it's called history.
It's you know how much has happened here.
Yeah.
So yeah, lots to come.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you being here.
Oh, thanks so much. And thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Beyond Rockets. Don't forget you can subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen, and on YouTube at Beyond Rockets. Be sure to follow me on Instagram at Beyond Rockets to stay up to date with new episodes as they are released. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed.